Dr. Walsh serves as science writer for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship's Emerging Scholars blog, where he contributes weekly articles on science and faith. So welcome today, Dr. Walsh. We're going to talk tonight a little bit about your book, Faith Across the Multiverse. And then we should also have time to talk a little bit about COVID. But let's start with an icebreaker. Who is your favorite superhero? And what is a superhero? What defines being a superhero?
Sure. So my favorite superhero is Multiple Man, Jamie Madrox. He's one of the X-Men characters from Marvel's X-Men line of comic books. He appeared most prominently in a book called X Factor about 10 years ago. He has the ability to make multiple copies of himself, and so allows him to be in more than one place at once, or to be able to accumulate more than one skill at a time. And he used that in that X Factor book. He used that skill as a private investigator. And I connected with him just because I often feel like I have multiple points of view on issues and not always sure which direction to go in. And so he has the ability to go in all the different directions at once. And I find that somewhat aspirational. In terms of what makes somebody a superhero, I think it's probably having some sort of exceptional ability and using that ability to benefit other people instead of or in addition to yourself, rather than using it exclusively to benefit yourself, which is probably what would make somebody a supervillain. And then there's also the trivia of technically DC Comics and Marvel Comics co-own the copyright on superheroes. So legally, I suppose you also have to be in a story published by one of those companies. But certainly in popular conversation, that's not always the case.
Right. Yeah. It seems like the term should be more broad than that, because you could have, say, Luke Skywalker with the Force. Seems like he would be a superhero, even though he's not either DC Comics or Marvel.
Sure. He has an exceptional ability that he uses to benefit other people.
Yeah. Well, normally I'm the heretic on the show, Doctor. So straying from orthodoxy is not something Kristine is used to. But is Luke Skywalker then? Is that your vote, Kristine?
Oh, no, was I supposed to give my vote? I was just supposing. I do like Luke Skywalker. He was probably the first hero of a movie I saw in a theater. Unless you count Annie, but she would not really have been a superhero. Maybe she has a super personality.
Yeah. For exceptional optimism, perhaps.
In the Doctor's book, he's got Squirrel Girl, and so it could come in under that heading a little bit. But so I'm more of a Han Solo guy than Luke Skywalker. He was too vanilla to me. But having said that, when it comes to my vote, and this is something the Doctor and I can discuss at another time because it'll probably make him cringe a little bit. I as a child growing up, I have always loved the heroes that didn't have superpowers. So I was attracted to Batman, Iron Man, Green Hornet, and the guys who use their wealth and their intellect to accomplish great things. And then as I got older, I realized that some stories have more to accomplish than simply defeating villains who are greedy or kind of knocking over a bank or something like that. And so I tended to believe that the greatest superheroes that we have in story form are Robin Hood and Zorro, because they fought corruption in their own governments, and it was a bigger thing than just Lex Luthor's greed. But that's a whole subject for another day.
That would include then, like, Princess Leia, right?
Oh, you just to go back to Star Wars, don't you? Yeah.
Corruption in the government.
It's no accident that Batman's origin story involves him, attending the Mask of Zorro at the cinema. Some versions of that origin story, and that's no accident. He comes from that tradition, a direct line from Zorro. So that makes a lot of sense.
Well, some people
Okay, so
just tuning in are going to accuse us, Kristine, of using Secretariat to pull a milk wagon. I know the doctor doesn't think that, but we are going to talk about some serious topics today. And among them are
alrighty.
some of the superheroes or the cultural concepts that we've just mentioned. We are really pleased to have Dr. Andy Walsh with us today. And before you think that he's an illustrator for Marvel, I'd like to ask Kristine to fill us in on just who Dr. Walsh is and his magnificent book, Faith Across the Multiverse.
All right, well, Dr. Walsh has written this magnificent book, Faith Across the Multiverse, which is really an enigma amongst this genre of writing, the science and faith intersection. So different than many books in this genre, I guess, that I've read, filled with parables from modern science and modern science fiction. Andy, tell us a little bit about your book.
Yeah, so the idea is exactly that, to take modern scientific concepts and weave them into something resembling a parable, not exactly in the same kind of storytelling way that Jesus did, but looking at the way that Jesus and other biblical writers used concepts from the physical world or the natural world, and concepts like agriculture, concepts about how plants grow, how plants are sown or planted, things from Peter in his epistle talks about metallurgy and how we refine metals. There are illustrations in the Psalms from using the stars in the sky and the heavens. All these things are used in the Bible as ways to get across different concepts about what God is like, since God is so far removed from our direct experience in some ways. And so we need that sort of help to bridge that connection to understand how to think about God, how we relate to God, and even how we relate to other people. And so thinking about how that functions in the Bible, how those illustrations or those parables function in the Bible, how those metaphors function in the Bible to get across those concepts, I wanted to take that approach and just use the language of contemporary science to do the same thing. So it's not trying to create a new theology, it's trying to express a familiar and traditional theology in a way that resonates with current language. So if you're more familiar with contemporary math or physics or something like that, it's talking about biblical concepts in a way that might perhaps be a little bit more familiar to you, more resonate with you. And if you're more familiar with the Bible, but you're not familiar with the science, hopefully that giving you some new language and some new concepts will enrich your reading of the Bible in some way. And then all of that is tied together with some stories from science fiction and comic books and movies as a way to provide some sort of human scale introduction to concepts that can be very abstract or very large or small in their actual physical scale. So they're outside of our day-to-day experience and make it a little bit harder to kind of find a place to enter in. And so I find that these particular stories help me to enter into thinking about those concepts, and hopefully it invites the readers to do the same.
So where did you get the idea to write this book?
So the origin story of the book goes back to graduate school. I was a part of an InterVarsity graduate Christian fellowship, and we were having a discussion one day about the return of Jesus and some of the passages in the Bible that make it sound as though Jesus would be returning to earth imminently from the perspective of writers who were writing 2,000 years ago. And so, 2,000 years later, we're kind of looking at those passages and going, well, how should we read these? How should we expect Jesus to return? How soon should we expect Jesus to return if we know that it's been 2,000 years? And I was having a conversation with somebody who was studying mathematics, and I hit upon a particular mathematical model called exponential probability distribution that has exactly that property that we were kind of wrestling with, this idea that no matter how long you've been waiting for something to happen, it's just as likely to happen in the next 10 minutes as it was in those first 10 minutes after you first were waiting for it, even though 2,000 years have elapsed. It's kind of a counterintuitive property, but mathematically it works out that particular probability distribution is what they call memoryless. It doesn't matter how long you've been waiting. And so when I brought that up, we both kind of went, oh yeah, that actually does help us to think about this question from the Bible in a different way and help us maybe understand it a little bit differently. And from that point on, I was kind of more sensitive to, hey, maybe there are other concepts from math, science, physics, computer science, whatever that might be, that might help me think about my Christian faith, how I read the Bible, and all those different questions. And after about 10 years of kind of collecting those in my head, I finally went, this feels like a lot of different things. Maybe there's a book-shaped object here that might be helpful to other people, and started writing it down. And when I was done, it seemed like there was enough for a book, and went from there.
Excellent. So how would you say your book differs from, say, a typical book on science and faith?
Yeah, so a lot of the science and faith books that you might come across are a little bit more technically focused on addressing specific questions of fact. Did all of life originate from a common set of ancestors billions of years ago, or did life originate 6,000 years ago in a variety of different special creation events? Or did the flood of Noah happen worldwide, or was it local, or was there any kind of flood, or is it all mythical? Those kinds of more questions of historical fact. What are the actual events that happened at some point in the past, and how can science to answer those questions? Or they're questions of maybe ethics, or how do we apply science in the current age, and how do we bring biblical perspectives of morality and ethics to questions of science? Those sorts of more technical questions. This is perhaps a little bit different in that it's not trying to answer any specific question like that about history or ethics or anything like that, but it's just trying to bring the language of science and math into the conversation of Christian theology, and trying to basically give people something new to use in their study of the Bible and their discussion of Christianity. So I think sometimes people feel like science is taking things away from their religious beliefs, right? I'm no longer allowed to believe in X, Y, or Z because science has ruled it out. And oftentimes that's not really actually what's happened, but I think sometimes people feel that way. And so I wanted people instead to feel like, oh, here science is giving me something. It's giving me language or concepts that I can use in conversation or in my own personal devotion or thinking about my Christian faith. And maybe even the way I'm using that is to say, well, this guy thinks that, the math of exponential probability distribution tells us something about Jesus' return. And I think that that's wrong, and I don't think that's a good model. That's still, now I have a new tool, I have new language to use to talk about why I think that's wrong and why I think some different model is correct. So it's not even necessarily trying to persuade you that these are the correct models or language or words to use to talk about these things, but just trying to enrich our vocabulary so that we have a better, more detailed opportunities for conversation.
No, I really like that, because you have different sections in your book that each start with the language of something, like the language of computer science, or the language of mathematics, or the language of physics. Tell us more about how this languages help us to be able to talk about things more.
Right. So, this is actually getting into an area of science where I'm not as, strongly versed, but, there is some thought in cognitive psychology about how having access to different words might influence how you can think about different things, or just having the ability to access words to name a concept makes it easier to talk about that than if you have to spend, 3 or 4 sentences describing it. If you can just say a single word, it makes your conversation more efficient, makes your discussion more detailed, and you can get deeper into a subject because you don't have to spend all that time rehashing the basics. And so, it's not necessarily that, so there's some versions of that, right, where, different languages of the world have different non-overlapping vocabularies, and that might shape the culture of the or the way that people think in those countries that use those languages. And it's not, that the strongest versions of that hypothesis are not borne out. But I think there's still some reason to think that having different words, having access to different words and concepts can have an influence on how we think about things, or can just make it easier to have certain kinds of conversations. Like that conversation I was having in that Bible study, by saying, oh, it's like the exponential probability distribution, my friend and I were able to then, dig in deeper and have a different kind of conversation than if we had to kind of work out, well, what are we talking about? What does the math of this look like? And, have an extended lecture on the math. So having that shared language just sort of facilitates those conversations. So the book is structured around the language from different disciplines. partly to give people a sense of what to expect from the different parts, to give it some sort of flow from the more abstract to the more concrete and practical. So we start with the language of mathematics, and then move into the language of physics, the language of biology, and finally the language of computer science, which I take to be sort of the study of how do we get things done, how do we practically do things. So even if computer science might sound abstract, like math, the kinds of problems that it deals with, or the kinds of questions that it deals with, are much more practical and concrete than a lot of mathematics might seem a little bit more esoteric. And so that's why it's structured around the concept of language.
Well, if I can jump in here just for a second, your first question, Kristine, was how the doctor's book is different from other apologetic books, and I'd like to chime in on that and invite a fellow PhD, not a fellow of mine, fellow of the good doctors, in to discuss this. And if you go to Amazon and you read some of the reviews, there's some really powerful statements. The one I'm about to share with you is from Pagan. Dr. Pagan starts his review with, "There are very few books that I will read twice or more. This will be one of them. In the spirit of full disclosure, I must state that I considered myself a very hopeful agnostic. I long for something more, something after this life, someone to thank for the life I'm living and for the people who are living it with me. Sometimes I'm sure that such a something exists." I think he means sometimes I'm sure it does not. Most of the time, I have not the foggiest idea. Enter this book. Dr. Andy Walsh has written one of the most lucid examples of how one can combine the majestic reality that science reveals about the known universe with the human longing for transcendence. So this is a compliment and a criticism. I share Dr. Pagan's view with why your book is different from other books. And the criticism is not of your book, Doctor, it is of modern Christian apologetics. It's something Kristine and I have talked about before. And it seems that modern Christian apologetics is kind of been so influenced by the Enlightenment. They're trying to reason everyone into the kingdom. And I think the reason your book is different is it speaks to that longing that many Christian philosophers have talked about throughout the ages, from Blaise Pascal to Augustine to C.S. Lewis, that hole in the heart that only God is big enough to fulfill, or that fount of joy that C.S. Lewis was looking for. And so it's not just the science in your book that makes a difference, but it's the combination with the cultural metaphors that you inject in each of these sections of the book. And it seems that you've recovered the element of story that's been missing in Christian apologetics. To paraphrase C.S. Lewis, he said that reason can lead us to the truth, but it's the imagination that yields understanding. Was this unconscious in when you were writing the book, or is this something that had worked on you that you wanted to share with the audience?
Yeah, so I mean, I certainly, although I don't think I talk about it in the book, certainly C.S. Lewis's fictional writing was big to me as a child, and some of his nonfiction writing has influenced me since. It wasn't necessarily the most, the only point of reference, but he was certainly, someone who I was conscious of. If nothing else, his legacy of being someone who had experience in other academic disciplines, writing in a space that overlaps with theology, and so feeling like, okay, there is an opportunity for people other than theologians to say something. Certainly not claiming to have written the definitive statement on anything, but being able to enter into that conversation, because we all have questions. We all need to talk about these things. Again, even if we're just trying to describe what it is that we don't believe, what we don't think, we're still having those conversations. We're still part of that discussion. We still need the ability to talk about that. And so, just trying to be a part of that, ongoing conversation with all of humanity, across all of time, not to be too grandiose. I wasn't necessarily setting out to do something that was counter to any particular theme in apologetics, but more, I guess, in a positive sense, just trying to write the kind of book that I would want to read. And I hadn't come across a book like this, hadn't come across a book that combined all these different influences and different threads. And so that I would take a stab at it myself, because that's how I think about these things. If I'm thinking about science, it doesn't take too long before some story or another, or some character, there's a connection there that might help me think about this. Or if I'm watching a movie, it doesn't take long before I'm thinking about the science related to it or the science behind it. And, and all those things, certainly also my, Christian background and Christian perspective is a part of it as well. And so it made sense to me to put them all together, because in my head, they're always all together in conversation anyway.
Yeah, one thing I really like about kind of the parable format, or the parable story pulling you in, is I think it eases the tension that sometimes people have such emotional baggage around the topic of science and faith and evolution and the age of the earth, that they've either dug a hole or they've picked a side and are there to defend a view. And I think the parable format kind of circumvents that and gets a conversation going in a less threatening way. Have you seen that or heard that from people who've read your book?
I don't know that anybody has expressed it in quite that way, but that was certainly part of the intent, is to say, hey, talking about relativistic physics or evolutionary biology is challenging. Talking about, even, exponential probability distributions, all these things are intimidating if they're unfamiliar words. They are unfamiliar concepts. They're oftentimes counterintuitive concepts. So let's not start there. Let's start by talking about Batman, right? Because lots of people, even if you've never read a Batman comic, even if you've never watched any of the Batman movies, most people have some concept of Batman. And, having watched or read any of that material is not a prerequisite to the book. Hopefully, it's more invitational than that. I tried to describe everything about these characters and stories that I needed to use in the text itself. So it wasn't like, okay, there's a reading list that's prerequisites before you can even start this book. But it's doing exactly, hopefully it's doing exactly what you said, that it's making it a little bit easier for us to start having this conversation. Hey, let's start talking about Superman. Let's start talking about Squirrel Girl. Squirrel Girl is fun and joyful and just, unendingly positive. And so she's a fun person to be around and talk about. So let's start there. And then, we can go on and have some conversations about, how we live our Christian lives or how we get along with other people. But let's get the ball rolling in a way that helps make more people comfortable rather than fewer people.
Well, it's in the Squirrel Girl section, I believe, of the book where you define what a hero is in kind of a Joseph Campbell-like way, with tongue-in-cheek, I guess. I think you said a hero sees a problem, finds the person who's causing the problem, and punches them until they stop. But then you said with Squirrel Girl, it's different. So can you share with the audience how Squirrel Girl uses empathy or uses her powers to not punch a person in the mouth, although that is in her quiver as well. But how do you relate that, though, to your faith as well?
Sure. So for anybody not familiar, Squirrel Girl is a comic book character from the world of Marvel Comics. She has, for unspecified reasons, a lot of squirrel attributes in addition to human attributes. She has a long bushy tail. She has heightened senses, an extra strength, and a lot of sort of basic superhero traits, but a partially squirrel-like appearance. She is also, in the most recent run of comics, a computer science undergraduate student. And a lot of the stories start with her and her university friends, start with some issue in their neighborhood or in their classroom or on their campus, before getting involved with somebody like Dr. Doom or Galactus or Kraven the Hunter or some, traditional supervillain. And sometimes there is peril that requires her to sort of act in in a physical way, and using fisticuffs or just sort of preventing somebody from causing further harm. But oftentimes what she would prefer to do is to enter into a dialogue with this person. Why are you doing the things that you're doing? What unmet needs do you have that has led you to pursue this particular course of violence or oppression or whatever the case might be? And so she has conversation. There's a story arc with a character named Mole Man, where she finds that she discovers that he's really kind of lonely and searching for a partner to share his life with. And so she doesn't matchmake for him, but she helps him to explore those feelings and to realize that that's what's motivating him, and to perhaps find healthier ways to meet those needs than to subjugate the human race. She has a conversation. We got Kraven the Hunter as a Spider-Man antagonist that also shows up in the story. And again, she has conversations with him about what are his unmet needs, what is he looking for, and ultimately, makes him an ally rather than an antagonist. So it's a common theme in a lot of her stories in these recent comics, of just kind of looking for that way to build shared empathy, build on common ground. What are the things that we have in common as humans? What are the needs that we have in common? How can we help each other meet those needs? And how can we find what unites us and build on that, rather than focusing on these narrow things that might divide us? And I think as Christians, that is something important to do as well. Within the church, I think it's important. It's very easy, because we're so focused on the details of Christian theology. It's very easy to get focused on the very hyper-detailed, narrow slices of theology that separate us from the denomination down the street. There's a time and a place for those conversations, but there's also a time and place for all the grand things that we have in common about our faith in God and Jesus, our belief in the incarnational ministry of Jesus, and the saving power of his resurrection, and all those things. And then, when we're ministering to people who aren't Christians, finding what we have in common with them. Somebody like Dr. Pagan, even though you don't believe that exactly the same things I do about God, we have a lot that we can share about our human experience, what it means to be human, what we're longing for, that sense of transcendence that we're looking for. So let's talk about that and build on that. And maybe we'll find that there's even more in common than we think, that we're not as far apart as we think. And while I haven't had as much time as I would like to with him in particular, that is definitely something that I think we've seen, where we met more as writers, but finding that there's a lot more that we have in common as well.
Lewis,
and we need more conversations in the church too. Go ahead, John.
I was just going to say that Lewis and Tolkien talked about this, about using their fiction to sneak in, using romantic fiction to sneak in deeper ideas of the Christian faith without being overtly allegorical about it all. You speak of both science and cultural comics and superheroes and so forth. Do you feel that both of those are equal ground as far as introducing subjects that people would rebuff or would have fortifications up against if you just came across and said, do you know Jesus? Or just dove right into a spiritual conversation?
Yeah, so I think certainly in the world of fandoms, there are strident opinions and people who feel strongly about different things, and people who are on the lookout for, well, I'm a Star Wars fan, so I don't talk to Star Trek people, or vice versa. And oftentimes those are the extremes and the small numbers of people, rather than a prevailing sentiment. There's a science fiction and comic writer named Cy Spurrier, who likes to say that factions speak louder than herds. Right? So small groups of people often are the ones that get the most attention and speak the loudest, but they don't represent the majority of people. And so I think that's some of what we see with the Star Trek versus Star Wars kind of stuff, or the Marvel versus DC. But certainly there are people for whom, if you bring up a particular science fiction topic or culture, pop culture topic, that may put up a barrier as opposed to building a bridge. And then there are the people that are just, anything that smacks of sci-fi or something geeky or nerdy or whatever, that's no thank you. I prefer, reality, or I prefer different kinds of entertainment or whatever. Or I don't think entertainment of any sort is worthwhile, and I prefer, more practical pursuits. There are certainly all those kinds of people, and and so for that reason, this approach is not going to help everybody. It's not going to work for everybody. But I do think there are people for whom being able to talk about science fiction, and similarly with science, there are people who aren't scientists themselves, who love science, who are always talking about science, reading science, enthusiastic about science, who made folks like Neil deGrasse Tyson into the celebrities that they are. And so that, talking about science will open those doors just as much as there are people. And as a scientist, I am well aware that there are plenty of people who, when you start talking about science, you can just see that they have checked out. They are thinking about anything else. And that's fine. I can't be all things to all people, but there are people, especially that category of people who are not necessarily scientists themselves, but who are very enthusiastic about science, and who I sometimes talk about as science adjacent, or fans of science, things like that. I think there are some unmet needs there in terms of Christian outreach. I think there are lots of books that are written by scientists who are Christian for other scientists who are Christians, or people who are thinking about becoming scientists who are Christians. But I think there's a different group of people who are, like I said, science adjacent, or just enthusiastic about science, but have some other career that also need to be reached with the gospel, and also need to have resources that serve them as well, even if they are Christians.
I think there's a group of people who are parents of kids who are science-minded, who maybe need to know enough how to wrestle with those facts that some books talk about, where maybe it isn't an interest of theirs in particular, but because their kids are interested in it, or because they're homeschooling, or because they're going to be sending their kids to a public university, or for whatever reason, they have an adjacent interest.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And hopefully, maybe something like this, something like Faith Across the Multiverse, is a little bit less intimidating than something that starts with the technical details. Or because it starts with a story maybe that you can share. I might not be able to read the same scientific literature, but we can watch a movie together and have a conversation about that. And then you can tell me more about your science.
Well, I hope I'm not jumping ahead, because I know Kristine wants to talk about the volume of the book. But at the end of the book, Doctor, you make almost an apologetic statement to your audience, because you're about to talk about the third rail of evangelicalism, which is evolution. And you bring up the point that really the whole book has been about evolution or changes. And you kind of plead with them to stay with you for the last few chapters. And at the very end, you make a plea, and you say something, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you say something to the point that you'd like to see the people in the church be more open to science, modern science, and you'd like to see scientists be more open to spiritual things. Now, I'm not aware of any polling on as far as comic book enthusiasts, but I'm pretty aware of the polling among your fellow scientists, and it's a minority, from what I understand, of scientists that embrace Christianity or our faith. So what is harder, in your opinion, or a more difficult process, introducing the church to modern science, or introducing some of your peers to be open to the spirituality that you've embraced?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So one of the interesting things, and Elaine Eklund, among other people, has been doing a lot of work on the demographics of scientists and religious belief. And religious belief among scientists, or scientific professions among religious folks, are more prevalent than are perhaps popularly aware of, and perhaps I might have even undersold it in the book. I think that in the United States, the numbers come out around 50% of scientists follow, identify with some version of a Christian faith. And then I think if you expand to other religions, it's an even higher percentage. I might be a little bit off on that, but if you look up Elaine Eklund, that name will steer you towards the latest research on that area. Those numbers are definitely lower than if you just took a cross section of all Americans. So there definitely is a difference between American scientists and the American population at large. But there still is a lot of overlap. And in my own personal experience, which obviously is very limited and anecdotal, I've not encountered any colleagues in the sciences who were themselves not Christians who were particularly belligerent or antagonistic to me or to other believers because of our Christian beliefs or other religious beliefs. I think in undergrad and grad school and other contexts, I probably interacted with scientists from not every religious background, but certainly multiple different religious backgrounds beyond Christianity, as well as scientists who were more of the agnostic or atheist persuasion. On the other hand, I have had some pushback in the church about my take on science, my particular pursuit of a scientific career. And so, I think in some ways, in my own personal experience, which may or may not generalize widely, it can be a little bit more challenging to get the church to engage in scientific topics than to get my colleagues in science to engage in sort of theological or these kind of grand questions of who are we and why are we here and what does it all mean. But that in both cases, even in that case, I would say it's a minority of people who are in the church that I've encountered who are antagonistic. Not that's not the majority position, but that is a place where I have met on occasion some pushback, some criticism, some is that what why would you think that, or why would you be interested in that topic as a topic of study?
That would be my experience as well. Maybe even more strongly. This is one of Elaine Eklund's book too that contain some of the survey information from multiple countries on how scientists think about religion, not so much on how church people think about science.
Yeah, that seems to be her focus, is what are the religious beliefs of scientists.
Yeah, very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So, given that there can be some pushback, even if it isn't always hostile, there's definitely some pushback on scientific topics within evangelical churches. And certainly not all Christians are even aware that there's a range of views that Christians hold on this subject. What are some things that we can do in a church environment to help pastors and youth leaders and youth ministers to be able to talk about this topic and reduce tensions and help especially science-minded kids understand that they don't have to choose a dichotomy, either science or faith?
Yeah, so I think if I could pick one thing, the number one thing that I would recommend for pastors and youth leaders and so forth is to look in your congregation or look in your community to see if there are scientists that you can actually have, talk to the kids or talk in the congregation in some fashion, whether it's a Sunday school class or a youth group meeting or, I've seen there are churches, crazy enough as it is, there are churches that actually have scientists from their congregation come up and co-preach sermons on Sunday morning. That may not work for every church, but I would encourage you to look for, somebody in your congregation or in your community. Perhaps they're not in your congregation, but they're in another church somewhere in your community. But there are lots of scientists out there who I imagine would be very happy and willing to help out in that way, to start a conversation, to answer questions, or just to model the fact that, hey, you can be a scientist and you can be a Christian, and those two things can go together. Because there are a lot of people that will go their whole lives never having met somebody in that category, even though there are millions of us, and we're all over the place, and we're not hiding. There's the reality that lots of people don't have a chance to interact with folks outside of, fairly small circles. And so, yeah, just providing people an opportunity to meet a scientist, talk to a scientist, whether or not they're a Christian, I think can help to just get rid of some of the fears about, oh, scientists are scary people or off-putting or, kind of out there in their thinking or whatever. And, I'd be happy to make myself available to churches. We live in a time when traveling remotely via the miracle of these sorts of teleconferencing technologies has become more acceptable and more widely used. So, I'd be happy to visit your small group or your Sunday school class or whatever via a medium like this, if that's possible, to have that conversation. And if I can't do it, there are plenty of other scientists who would be happy to do something like that as well. If you're having a hard time finding somebody in your local community or congregation.
You'd be an excellent guest, and if I was still in a pulpit, I'd definitely take you up on that. But Kristine brought something up, and it just kind of coincides with your answer just here about the false dichotomy that is presented to a lot of children or others between either, you accept a 6,000-year-old Earth and that T-Rex bunked with, I like to say T-Rex bunked with Noah on the Ark, or if you don't accept that, you might as well go with the atheists. It's either modern science or taking the Bible literally, and they don't know that there are people like you or Francis Collins or any of the number of people you mentioned at the end of your book as far as good reading, Catherine Applegate and others. So let me ask you in this way, when that false dichotomy is presented, it's not merely presented by the fundamentalist wing or corner of evangelicalism, it's also presented by the hostile atheist, who basically says the Bible isn't compatible with modern science because they too accept the idea that Genesis is history, and that's the only way, that's the only hermeneutic that is legitimate. And so if the two loudest voices in the room are, this hostile atheist and this, maybe you might say, very loud fundamentalist, and they agree with each other, how do you fight through the friendly fire and the enemy fire to be heard among that cacophony? And I know you're going to say your book, you're going to say buy your book, and I agree. I think your book is a great way. But how do we at large overcome, our own brothers calling us heretics and picking up stones, and the enemy saying, basically, modern science is true, so you can't believe that superstition?
Yeah, you've put it exactly the way that I often think about it, which is, at the risk of putting too fine a point on it, if Ken Ham and Richard Dawkins agree on one thing and one thing only, that must be right? Because they don't agree on anything else. And so it must be true that there's an either or choice that has to be made there. Obviously, they represent the two different options, but there must be an either or choice. And I think that is exactly a case of the faction speaking louder than herds situation. Most people do not fall into either one of those categories. Most people, I think, are aware that there are options, even if they're not necessarily aware of all the options or know people who represent all the different options of ways that you can combine or not combine modern science with Christian or other religious beliefs. I think a lot of people are open to that and just need to maybe have some more resources or more opportunities to engage. Like they might know, I know that there are people that think different ways than I do, but I don't know who they are and I don't know exactly what they think. And so there are some good books. There's a 4 Views on Evolution book or something like that, or 4 Views on Creation Evolution book. There are other books like that where people enter into these conversations and say, hi, this is what I represent. This is what I think. And I'm going to have a conversation with these 3 or 4 or 5 other people who think differently, so that you get a range of options. I think those are good places to, something like that is a good place to kind of get a sense of just what's out there. and to see that there are other ways of doing things. Again, finding scientists and giving voice to people who do represent that less well heard or less loud herd in the middle, and not even necessarily in the middle, but the herds of people, the large numbers of people who don't think in those extremes, providing a way to give them more of a voice, so that we do hear from them more often, and maybe not in any one individual, but just hearing from those people in general as a whole. So that you're getting something, a little bit from lots of different people in your congregation about what they think on these different topics, rather than just the one or two voices because they happen to, have a seminary background or happen to have the right, credentials or what have you. Letting more people be a part of that conversation, so that we do hear, oh yeah, because there are lots of people that if you give them space, they surprise you with, oh yeah, I am aware of this and I have read about this or that and science topic or that science and faith book. And I have my own thoughts and I'd like to share them, but I've never shared them because nobody ever asked, and I never really thought that I had anything to say that was worthwhile or interesting. And so we pay attention to the strident voices because they say extreme things that seem attention-getting, if nothing else. And so we've trained the rest of us to think, well, I don't say anything that extreme, so I'm not that interesting to listen to. And so I think we can find a way to just give that space to people. Go ahead.
I was talking with the family at our church that started homeschooling last year because of COVID and the situation with schools being online and their kids are younger, and it seemed like the right thing to do. And I asked them this morning, so are your kids going to go back to the public school, or are you going to keep homeschooling? And the answer was that they are going to keep homeschooling them, and this year the oldest two are going to be going to a local homeschool co-op. And I know that this homeschool co-op, their science courses are only and very dogmatically young Earth creation. And, they're not going to hear multiple views and even have a chance to evaluate what do other scientists think, and, how can we reach families like this that, I know they just don't know. They've just not really thought about it. Neither parent is a scientist or very science-minded, and they're a wonderful Christian family, and they want their kids to have this Christian curriculum and learn that God is the creator. And, it's going to be a long time before they're ready for, really in-depth topics on evolution or geology or paleontology that will contradict what they're going to be taught at young ages. So this year, I think homeschooling doubled with COVID, and there's a lot of families that I think are in similar positions. What kind of ideas do you have for, preventing these families from going off in a direction that could in the future lead to this dichotomous thinking? And I personally know so many people who then have gone off to college and found out that the young Earth view is not supportable and they had never been taught otherwise. And why would you not provide me with all this other information that's out there? And what else are you hiding from me? Or how do we prevent that from happening?
Yeah, so that's a lot of good stuff there. Specifically on the homeschooling topic, I do know, before I forget to mention it, I do know that the BioLogos organization that was started by Francis Collins, who came up before, they have been working on homeschool curricula or supplements to homeschool curricula, specifically for homeschoolers. They have a whole forum on their website that is specifically for homeschooling parents who are looking for resources or just want to ask questions about how to teach science and faith and how to deal with teaching creation from a perspective that allows for evolutionary biology. And that's a private forum so that people feel a little bit safer asking their questions. So, if you're looking for something like that, that's the place that I know of off the top of my head if you're looking for those kinds of resources. In terms of folks who aren't looking for those resources, how do we engage with them? I think that's a little bit of a bigger challenge. I think, part of the difficulty with engaging some of these scientific topics is there is a clear Christian version. Young Earth creationism is a very clear Christian specific take on some of these questions and topics. If we flip around and say, we're just going to talk about, contemporary evolutionary biology, there's not necessarily a specific Christian spin on that. There's not necessarily specific Christian textbooks or, homeschooling materials or whatever. There's just whatever, but, just kind of the secular materials. And so I think that's part of why it's off-putting, right? Is that, here I have this thing that's distinctly Christian, and I've chosen homeschool because I want my kids to get a distinctly Christian perspective on educational topics. And so, what else are they going to choose? Why wouldn't they go that route? So I can understand that thinking where that would come from. I think that there is a need for more resources. I'm not sure that I'm the person that can create all those educational resources because I don't have an educational background, or I don't have an education background rather. So maybe there's somebody out there listening, and it's not necessarily even educational resources, Sunday school resources, VPS curricula, children's storybooks, all these things that, have been kind of on my mind lately of, the only things out there come from a fairly specific point of view because that is seen as the most uniquely Christian point of view. And the Garden of Eden and Noah's Ark, they're great stories for kids because they involve animals and things that, and all the things that kids love, just sort of naming animals, learning the different kinds of animals, right? That's a great activity for young children. And so the Garden of Eden and Noah's Ark are natural stories to introduce kids to those things. And you're right, a 4-year-old is going to have a hard time with, okay, well, we have this story about Noah's Ark, but maybe it was a regional flood or, these kinds of different things. That there's a level of nuance there that's maybe difficult to get across in a children's book. But I think there are opportunities there, and hopefully there will be other people, not just myself, who have the idea of, hey, let's write a kid's book or a Sunday school curriculum that embraces some of these other points of view. If we can write kids books to help kids learn about people of all different kinds, right? And how to be friendly to your neighbor when they don't look exactly like you, or how to be friendly to your neighbor when they are they're disabled, or there's different things that we do teach kids from an early age. Just how do we get along with people who are not just like me? I think we can teach kids how to get along with people who think differently about scientific topics or have a different kind of career than maybe my mom or dad do, or that I think I might want to have. And I'm sure somebody can find a creative way to engage young children with those sorts of things in a way that they can relate to.
Yeah,
and I also wanted to. The other thing you made me think of is, my own experience was I grew up going to Christian school. I was taught from Becca science books, and then later Bob Jones University Press science books. So I got the young Earth creation perspective only, and that was the only right way to be a Christian and read the Bible, was to take that perspective. And then I went to college and was taught very different things. The kinds of arguments that I was prepared to have were not even the kinds of arguments that anybody was having. That wasn't the conversation anybody was having. So I was a bit baffled as to what to do. And instead of feeling like, well, I have to reject it all, I was very fortunate to meet other Christians through InterVarsity who came from different backgrounds and had different perspectives. And so it was very helpful to me to be able to say, okay, I'm not necessarily going to change what I believe, but it's good to know that there are Christians who are faithful Christians who take the Bible seriously, who believe in the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus, all these things that I believe in, but they have a different reading on the book of Genesis. So it's good to know that there are other options out there, so that if I do have questions, I know where to go, and that I know that I don't have to give up my Christianity entirely. So I think that is an important value in just sort of being able to expose folks to these different options early on and often, so that they feel like, okay, I don't have to check out everything just because of this one particular narrow technical topic. I can still retain my core Christian beliefs and core Christian identity and explore some of these sort of secondary or tertiary doctrinal issues more freely.
I've got a little pushback for those of our listeners who might be on the skeptical or the agnostic or atheist end of the spectrum. And so I'm going to put on my skeptic hat here and challenge you on a few things. And to do so, I want to welcome Dr. Pagan back into the conversation.
This is his book.
I'm sorry?
This is his book, Strange Survivors.
Okay. Hold on. Let me come to that. There. Okay.
Just so you know, if anybody's interested in it, it's a very good book.
Outstanding.
Maybe we should have him on our show sometime.
We definitely should have him on our show sometime. This is actually from the end of his review on Amazon. He says this book is uplifting, period. I want to point out again that he's not a follower of Jesus Christ. He calls himself a very hopeful agnostic. And to me, one of the signs that this is a really healthy direction, Dr. Walsh's book, is that he actually appeals to people outside of the tribe, where I think a lot of Christian apologetics is just written for the choir. But this book is an uplifting read to a person like me who delights on the majesty and mystery of the natural world and also has spiritual longings. This book is pretty close to perfect. One of my favorite examples of these thoughts on science and faith is the illustration of sin using relativity, the speed of light limit, and Christ. This illustration got me misty-eyed, and it was not the only part of the book that did. The very last paragraph almost made me cry properly. Using that as a place to jump off, the Christian concept of sin, Doctor, to a world that hasn't grown up in the Christian paradigm with that kind of vocabulary, how would you explain to a peer, maybe in the scientific world, what you mean by sin? And how is your definition of sin different in any way than the naturalist's definition of what it means merely to be a Homo sapien?
Yeah, so those are good questions. So, and that's part of the motivation of the book is, Christians, we're very comfortable with words like sin and grace and some of these different topics, faith, and they are part of, in some ways, a jargon that we use. And there are lots of benefits, as I talked about before, to having language like that, but it also can be off-putting if you're not familiar. And so I was hoping to be able to talk about some of those concepts that are represented by something like sin using different languages, in this case, the language of physics and the science of relativity, as a way to just sort of start that conversation in a different way. So sin, as I understand it, is, God has put forth a certain standard for behavior, morality, how to live, how to relate to him, and how to relate to our fellow human beings. And anything that falls short of that standard that he's put forward would be considered sin in Christian teaching. And there are all kinds of specific examples of sin and different categories of sin. And the Catholic tradition has specific technical categories. Evangelical Protestants are perhaps a little bit less taxonomic about our sin, but we can certainly give you a laundry list of things that we would consider sin. And my focus was not so much on litigating the particulars of that laundry list, because there are certainly some topics in our present moment where there's a lot of disagreement about even which specific behaviors or lifestyles or choices would be deemed sinful or not. And I'm not the person to answer those questions for anybody else specifically, but I wanted to address more of just that concept of what does it mean to have a standard to measure by, and how do we think about the metric of how our lives compare to that. Because I think it's easy to think of things, it's always easiest to think in things in terms of sort of linear and even sort of transactional terms, right? So morality or ethics is sort of a transactional, I either do good things and earn credits, or I do bad things and earn demerits. And hopefully my credits outweigh my demerits or something like that, right? And the science of relativity gives us a slightly different way of thinking about that, because there is a standard, there is sort of a frame of reference by which everything else is measured. In this case, the speed of light. The speed of light sort of provides the framework around which other measures in physics are done. But it turns out that you can't, except for light, you can't accelerate anything with mass to the speed of light. And so you don't have that strict linear, like, oh, if I can just keep going faster, I'll eventually get to that sort of perfection, or get to that limit, or get to that thing that I want to achieve. You're always going to fall short on your own terms. And, that concept of falling short is a very Christian one, and comes out of the language of the Bible. How does that differ from a naturalist notion of what it means to be human? I think, there's a lot of discussion about to what extent are the things that are labeled sin in the Bible there because doing those things hurts human flourishing, and doing what God promotes instead, the things that aren't sins, the things that are virtuous or good fruit, that those promote human flourishing. And so there's a way of kind of approaching Christian morality and Christian concepts of sin that looks an awful lot like almost a utilitarian kind of ethic, right? That just, God, all of these things are here because God knew that they would be good things for us to do to promote human flourishing, and so that's why his commands are the way that they are. And I think there is a certain truth that I think that does get you so far. But I do think that there are certain things in the Bible that are more about setting ourselves apart, and they might seem somewhat arbitrary, and that maybe because they are somewhat arbitrary choices, right? That the point is not doing this specific thing is the right thing so much as making a specific choice that is distinctive is what sets us apart and identifies us as people who are following after Jesus. And so there, it's not so much about maximizing human flourishing so much as we're trying to establish a particular identity, and to signal to ourselves, to signal to God, and to signal to people around us, hey, this is the choice that I've made, this is the path that I am following, and this is how we set ourselves apart. Hopefully none of those things are contrary to human flourishing. I think there's lots of slack within that concept of human flourishing. There's lots of slack for making different kinds of choices. And so I think within that, some of those choices that represent sin or Christian ethic that are perhaps maybe more on the arbitrary side allow us to set ourselves apart in that way. So that's where I think it might be somewhat different than a purely sort of naturalist or materialist pragmatic approach to ethics of, well, we're just going to do what's right because it benefits the most people, or it is the most altruistic, or however kind of whatever approach you might take to it. I think hopefully we will align on lots of those things, right? Hopefully if there are things that are good for human flourishing, that we as Christians and folks who are not Christians of all other persuasions, other religious beliefs, or folks who are philosophically, materialist or atheist or agnostic, hopefully we'll all agree that those are good things to do. But in those other areas where there's slack, where there's freedom to choose one or the other, there might be some distinctives of Christian ethics and Christian concepts of sin that might be where we might choose differently just because we're trying to create a particular identity.
From the scientific perspective, an argument of Carl Sagan and others has been that the universe is so vast and deep time so significant, and I can think of Anthony Flew, who came to be a theist toward the end of his life, but when pressed about Christianity, he declined, at least in public, by stating that he had some problems with the idea of eternal conscious torment and the very Calvinist understanding of Romans 9, that God selects winners and losers without them having an opportunity, which you do cover in your book in a chapter on free will and sovereignty. But my question to you is more from the Carl Sagan perspective. With considering such deep time, billions of years, and such vastness to the universe, I can see how a skeptic might come to conclude that there's got to be a creator behind all this all. But how does one make the leap from God the creator to somebody who's a personal God How do you make the leap from the God of the galaxies to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I'm not sure that there is a purely scientific line to get to that destination. Um, because I think you're right that there are a lot of folks who feel like, okay, maybe there's some higher concept, being, something, right? There's some higher power, higher calling, something transcendent. I'm okay with that. Sometimes the notion of Spinoza's God or different things gets thrown around, um, or deism. If we're going back to the Age of Enlightenment, right? That kind of thing of, oh, maybe there was somebody at the beginning. And I'm not sure that a purely scientific apologetic gets you to the personal God of the Bible or to the person of Jesus Christ. That's certainly not how I arrive at that particular set of beliefs. I think there are perhaps approaches in terms of methodology or thinking that are similar, right? We can still take an evidential approach. What is the evidence that a person named Jesus lived in Nazareth and taught the things that are recorded in the Gospels? What is the evidence that he died and then lived again sometime afterwards? And we might approach that evidence from a more scientific mindset. We might approach that evidence from a more historical mindset. But it is still a question to which there is some evidence that we can address from an evidential perspective. And so a scientist might find that somewhat familiar in terms of methodology or thinking. But I'm not sure that you can derive from a sort of a Paley-esque or a argument from theology or an argument from ontology to get to and then Jesus rose again on the third day. I think you do need the special revelation of the Bible to come to those particular beliefs. That can be supported by evidence from outside of the Bible, but I think that's kind of the point of the Bible, is that and the point of why we have these categories of special and general revelation in Christian theology, that there are certain things that you're just not going to know unless God tells you. And the biggest act of special revelation was that incarnation of Jesus. There were certain things that were so important to God to tell us, either in word or in deed, that he actually had to come down to earth and say or do them. And no amount of physics or biology or chemistry or mathematics or computer science was going to get us there, because those things aren't encoded in the atoms of the universe. They were encoded in the person of Jesus. And as a final point of evidence, something that I like to think about is the fact that I'm a Christian because I go to church on Sunday. And you might think, well, no, it's the other way around. You go to church on Sunday because you're a Christian. And it's certainly true that I go to church because I'm a Christian, but the distinctiveness of attending church on Sunday points back to the resurrection of Jesus. This was a community of religious folks who had organized their religious lives around worship on Saturday. And something happened 2,000 years ago to make them completely reorganize their calendar and pattern of worship to center around Sunday instead of Saturday. And so that's evidence that we can look at in the world around us, right? It's not a particularly scientific question of when do people go to church, but it is evidence that we can see in the world around us. And again, by itself, it is not the most compelling or a single definitive thing, but it raises questions, right? Well, why is it that the case? Why do we have two-day weekends in the Western world, and why do so many people go to church on Sunday? And I think following those questions can point you to some of the other sources of evidence and some of the other answers in a way that, again, hopefully is a familiar process, even if it's not the same kinds of data sets that scientists are used to working with.
That expression, something happened 2,000 years ago, could be a good book title, because I think Andy Stanley points to the fact that something instigated a flurry of writing 2,000 years ago when it wasn't commonplace and among a group of people who were notoriously illiterate. So That is a moment of curiosity that we all must consider, no matter where we are in the spectrum of belief. This is almost an unfair question to ask after such a beautiful answer that you just rendered, but it gives us a segue into the other hat that you wear in this world that makes you actually an expert worth listening to on something such as the COVID virus. So we spoke a lot today about Christians and the role they play in this understanding, and you write to them as an audience in your book and even plead with them in a number of places. But if the Holy Spirit, if what the Bible says about the Holy Spirit is true, and he's going to lead us into all truth, and he is going to be the comforter, and if we have the mind of Christ and we have the advantage of the Bible, and we certainly aren't living in darkness like the natural man of 1 Corinthians, why do you feel, Doctor, that there are 40,000 different denominations, and that Christians, when it came to astronomy, dug their heels in and said no for a couple hundred years, and now Christians, when it comes, at least in the Western hemisphere, when it comes to Darwin, have dug their heels in for another couple hundred years? And why is it that in America, at least, they won't wear a mask, and some of them won't even get the vaccination? So I guess what I'm asking you is, if what we understand of the Holy Spirit is true, why do you have to put on kid gloves to introduce modern science to modern Christians?
Yeah, wow, there's a lot there. So let's start with the end. I think that there are just certain realities of psychology and human interaction, right? That you have to meet people where they are, and people are in different places when it comes to science, when it comes to public health, when it comes to modern biology. They have had different educations, right? We talked about that a little while ago. There are people who have radically different educational backgrounds on how biology works, where we come from, and all those kinds of questions. There are people who have had different personal experiences with physicians, with the medical system, with the healthcare system, that color their perception of the whole enterprise. Many healthcare workers are doing their best every day, day in and out, to serve people. But sometimes people do have negative experiences. Very rarely because of actual bad actors, occasionally more often because of just gaps in the system, or the incompleteness of human knowledge, that we don't know everything about every human body and how to best treat it. And so, all those things add up to a wide diversity of opinions, understandings, information, education on how to approach a topic like a global pandemic. And you have to meet people where they are in those different places so that you can have a conversation with them. If I start talking about the technical details of the molecular biology of the virus, and folks don't know any of those words, we're not having a conversation. I'm just yelling at them or blabbing at them or whatever. You have to meet people where they are, and I think Jesus is a great example of that. At the risk of over sentimentalizing the gospel, or being a little bit twee about these things, or over theologizing science, Jesus was very good at identifying where people were, what they needed, and what they needed to hear to be able to engage with his message. He didn't take a one-size-fits-all approach. Sometimes he was very direct and contradictory and rebuking. Sometimes he was very empathetic. Arguably he was always empathetic, but sometimes he was very sympathetic, perhaps is a better word. He knew what different people need to hear, and just the reality of human psychology, that we have to be able to trust somebody before we can take in the information that they're sharing with us. And so building that trust and finding ways to engage in those conversations is an important part of public health. That's part of what makes public health different from medicine, although they overlap, is that part of public health is figuring out on a large scale how do we communicate in a way that people can hear. That's different from individual physicians can get to know their patients and have those individual conversations. At a public health level, we have to figure out what's the best way to message to an entire group of people so that they can hear. And sometimes that means not saying every fact in the most detailed way possible. Not saying, doesn't mean we say things that are false, but it means that we can't get into every single technical detail, or we can't address things. We can't put things maybe as strongly as we might otherwise wish to, because people just aren't going to hear that. It's a constant balance of what are people able to hear, what will get the most people to do the most good for the health of the most people, and it's an ongoing exploration of how to handle that messaging and how to handle those interactions. I don't think I answered all your questions, but hopefully that gets us started.
Right. So as the Chief Science Officer at Health Monitoring Systems, you've been looking at this data, you've been posting quite a bit about it that I've seen on Facebook and in the Emerging Scholars blog. So things where I am are looking pretty good. COVID cases are down, deaths are down. Is the pandemic over?
So no, the pandemic is not over. There are outbreaks on every inhabited continent in the world, and so that's a pretty clear sign of an ongoing pandemic. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're in exactly the same situation that we were a year or 18 months ago. And that doesn't mean that everybody is in the same situation. By different metrics, there are two other pandemics that are currently ongoing: the HIV pandemic and the tuberculosis pandemic. Those are in certain communities. Those are both considered to be ongoing pandemics and have been for decades. But not everyone's experience around the globe of those two pandemics is the same. Right? Most people in the United States probably go through years of their lives without ever thinking about tuberculosis. And that's not true for everyone in the world. And so the same thing is we're seeing now with COVID-19 is that, and it's always been the case, but I think it's becoming more pronounced now as vaccination rates vary, is that different people's experience of the pandemic is different depending on their regional, local, and national level situations. And so for some people, that may mean that, they can go about doing most of the same activities they would have done 2 years ago. And for other people, it means that very much right now things are there's significant spread, and they need to take additional precautions to guard the health of themselves and their neighbors. And so, no, it's not over, but that doesn't necessarily, that's just one bit of information, and you need lots of bits of information to be able to figure out what's the right thing to be doing in your community and for your own personal life choices.
So what are some important bits of information that we should be aware of in order to make good choices for the public health of our local communities?
Yeah, so at a minimum, you want to
still need to wear a mask.
Right. So at a minimum, you want to be aware of what the recommendations are in your jurisdiction, in your community. So most likely in the United States, that means that there is a state or a county health department that has issued some sort of guidance on masking, on distancing, on the right number of people to have in restaurants and stores and so forth, on the right way to handle schooling. There's also guidance from the CDC. The CDC guidance gets a lot of attention because it's national level guidance, but those recommendations are primarily for the benefit of state and local health departments, who are the ones who actually decide what the regulations are for their community. So you can go by what is being said by your local public health agency, and if you're not in the United States, there's also the actual hierarchy and the structuring may be different, but there's still going to be some public health authority somewhere who is providing guidance in your area about when and where to wear masks. Again, how many people can be in a store safely at a given time. If you want to engage a little bit more deeply, things to consider are, what is the vaccination rate in your community? Here in the United States, that can vary by, a few tens of percentage points depending on what state you're in and what county you're in different states. Some places are in the 60s and 70s, and in some age groups are even higher than that. And then in other parts of the country, we're still in the 40% of vaccination rate. So that's something to be keep in mind. The higher the vaccination rate in your area, the less likely there is to be significant transmission. And so there may be less need, if you are yourself vaccinated, there's less need to think about masking. If you're in an area where fewer people are vaccinated, it may be appropriate still to wear masks in some contexts. And there are some contexts like public transportation where it's recommended that everybody still be wearing masks. So those are the things to keep in mind. And then the other thing is, what is the actual local transmission rate going on in my community? What are the case counts? How many new cases do we have? How many hospitalizations we have? Those numbers are pretty readily available. If you're interested in that, can also inform decisions. And then it also comes down to, what's your own personal health situation? Do you have some sort of condition that means your immune system behaves differently than the average person? You know your own vaccination status. You know your own history with other conditions that might predispose you to a more serious reaction to this virus, such as a history of respiratory ailments or a history of diabetes or some of these other things that seem to be associated with higher risk of serious outcomes. So you'll need to take those into account. You can always talk to a physician about what's appropriate for you if you have questions about your own health status. They're the people who will know best your history, your personal circumstances, and what's going on in your community, and can provide further guidance about, if you're not vaccinated, what's the right vaccine for me, or when, do I still need to think about masks and so forth, because for my own personal health. Because there's two parts to the mask, right? Some of it is my own personal health, preventing myself from getting sick, and some of it is preventing that spread so that we don't get into another situation where we have overwhelmed the healthcare system, right? If we all got sick at the same time, there's not enough beds for us all in the hospitals. And that's a big part of the mask, and a big part that I don't know was always as clearly communicated as it could have been, that it's not just about protecting my own personal health, it's about preserving common resources, shared public goods like healthcare infrastructure, like the number of ICU beds in the hospital, and making sure that we're being good stewards of those resources by limiting the transmission. Even if the personal risk to myself of getting serious illness is quite low, I still need to do my part to help steward the resources of ICU beds and ventilators in my community to make sure they're available to the people who might need them going forward. So those are all the things. I know that's not a simple yes or no. Yes, you can wear a mask. No, you don't have to wear a mask. I know that's what people want to know, and I can't answer that for every person in every situation because of all those variables that I talked about. But and when in doubt, look at your local public health department for guidance on what they're recommending. Go by whatever rules apply. Stores and schools and so forth, they're still allowed to ask for people to wear masks, even if it's not generally required, because maybe they know something about the health status of their employees or something like that. So be considerate of those rules when you are in public places. Ask your doctor if you have questions about your own personal health status. And then if you want to keep track of vaccination rates and infection rates in your community, and think about wearing a mask if the vaccination rate is down or the infection rate is up, that's the best guidance that I can offer.
All right, so let's talk vaccines for just a moment. Currently, there's approval of the Pfizer vaccine for ages 12 and up in the U.S. So I have heard some people who are concerned about some enlargement of the heart issue that has been caused in some of the younger boys and men who've received that vaccine. What's the risk of COVID compared with the risk of the vaccine? And is that risk equal across age groups? Is there a place at which point that risk is such that someone should decide not to get a vaccine because of the risk and just hope not to get COVID? Tell us about the risks of vaccines right now. Right.
So there have been some rare cases of more serious side effects from some of the vaccines. As you indicated, as they rolled out the Pfizer vaccine to the 12 to 15 age group, there were small numbers of children in that age group who experienced some symptoms related to cardiac issues, inflammation around the heart, and things like that. In most cases, those symptoms resolved without treatment. In other cases, they were manageable with treatment. I don't know the outcome of every last single one of those people, but I know that overall they were very rare side effects of the vaccine. Most children did not experience that. So the risk of those is still fairly low. And there are risks of all of the things that people have experienced as side effects of the vaccine are also risks of the virus, right? That people are experiencing that because their immune system is responding to the protein that the vaccine either delivers or has your body make. Or that protein is interacting with other facets of your physiology to produce these symptoms. And so that virus is also part of that protein is also part of the virus. So the risk is also there of all of those symptoms and side effects occurring if you were to get infected as well. So I still think, and the risks are higher, and the risks of more severe complications are higher. They're more common with a viral infection than with the vaccine. So my sense is that it still makes sense to pursue vaccination where it has been recommended. So that means for ages 12 and up, it is still being recommended for all kids. If the data continues to come in and something changes, obviously go by the current guidelines and recommendations. But as of right now, the assessment is that the vaccines will do much more good than harm from these rare instances of side effects by preventing more common serious responses to the virus itself. And that is true in the older age groups as well, right? That the vaccine provides more protection than it does risk of serious side effects. And when you get up into the older age groups, obviously the virus presents a very high risk of serious outcomes. And so the vaccine is very beneficial to those communities, and we're seeing the highest vaccination rates in those communities, partly for that reason and partly because they've had access to it the longest. Going forward, I think there are some important questions to be asking as we get into the younger and younger age groups, because serious illness from the virus is so rare in the younger age groups. I think it is appropriate to ask the question of how young is it appropriate to give these vaccines, and that's what the FDA and the CDC and other agencies around the world will be considering, right? But we can't answer those questions until we have the data. So there are clinical trials ongoing with vaccines in young below the age of 12 to find out how do they react to the vaccine, and is it safe enough to warrant continuing to roll it out to younger and younger age groups. And we'll just have to wait for those clinical trial results to come in before I can give a definitive answer. Well, I can't give the definitive answer, but before I could give a more concrete answer on younger children. But for the age groups for which it is currently authorized, from everything that I've seen, the vaccine provide more benefit than just taking the chance on viral infection. Yes, plenty of people are going to get the virus and not have any kind of serious illness, and they may wind up feeling fine, and that was that there wasn't any need to do anything else. But you don't know exactly which category you're in, and at a population level, which is what I deal with, from a public health perspective, there will be more benefit from people getting the vaccines than from than any harm that it might cause relative to just letting people get the infection from the virus itself.
So if there's one thing you could tell our listeners who maybe are hesitant or they have family members who are hesitant, what would you advise? Do you generally advise getting vaccinated? Is there a preferred vaccine that you recommend? What would you just kind of in summary, what would you recommend? Which I know is hard to say because of individuals, but.
Right. So I can't really recommend everything for any individual. I think what I can say is, in my household, we have people under the age of 15 who have been vaccinated. And of all the people in my household, we have, across all the people in my household, we have all 3 of the vaccines that are currently authorized for use in the United States. So I think that tells you what, I think that's more relevant than numbers or whatever. That tells you what I am willing to do for my family and what I think is appropriate for my family. And that, I feel like that's a little bit more of where the rubber meets the road. So yeah, I think the vaccines are a good thing to consider for everybody for whom they are authorized. If you have questions about your own personal medical history because of immune status or something like that, talk to your physician. But at a population level, they are doing a lot of good for a lot of people, and I hope that everyone around the world gets the opportunity to benefit from them, either personally by getting them or because everyone else, because large numbers in their community get them, and so they're protected that way.
All right, well, thank you so very much for your time. I'd just like to show your book once more for people who are interested in learning more. Check out Faith Across the Multiverse. This is an especially important book to read if you like Marvel or DC Comics, because it's just chock full of examples and parables and illustrations and references to pop culture and sci-fi and comic books and superheroes. All interwoven with deep thoughts on science and faith. And thank you so very much for joining us today.
Yes.
Thank you for this opportunity. It was a great conversation.
Personally speaking, when you give your list of books at the end that you recommend, I had just about all of the science ones. I had Francis Collins, I had Scott McKnight, Dennis Veneman, I had Catherine Applegate. But your book left me wanting to find out more about Squirrel Girl, who I had never heard of until I read your book. So there were a lot of cultural references you made that when you put it together with your argument, was really moving. I agree with Dr. Pagan, who said there were moments that I was laughing and there were moments that I was almost brought to tears as well. I've never read a book like yours. It's on a shelf of its own just because it's so unique. So I highly recommend it, and I really appreciate you coming on the show, Doctor.
Thank you for those
And we're having Catherine Applegate on August 8th for another live stream. So we'll have a chance to ask her more about curriculum and the BioLogos supplemental integrate curriculum that they're offering and the latest updates there.
I love how you snuck that plug in. So thank you for that. Folks at home, if you enjoyed this interview, please share it and buy the book. Buy 2 copies, 1 to loan. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.